Hello!
Hi!
You've got good light. You're all aglow over there.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's because I don't actually believe in desks, and everything interesting in my house visually is literally away from my couch. So I'm always like, how do I position? I'm like trying to get better at Zoom because I realized that a lot of my meetings, since I work from my couch, people can literally see me like lounging with a blanket, and I'm like, yes.
Memo approved.
Yeah.
So this is Rhiana Gunn-Wright. She is an expert in climate policy, and she is one of the people behind the Green New Deal and creating that, framing that vision and resolution. And she is a friend, which is lucky for me. You should definitely be following her on Twitter, where she is much more active and sharing useful things. And it's our guns on that with two.
Yeah.
Find her over there. And thanks for joining me.
Oh, no problem. I realize now, looking at your face versus my face, I'm like, oh, right, there's probably a computer version of Instagram where you like don't hold your phone.
Oh, I have my iPhone app is open and my phone is like in that case, like standing.
That's the plug. I've always wondered how people have like stable IG live feed.
I ordered like a tripod thing for it, but so you know.
Oh, so you're less vain than me. I don't have a tripod, but I'm like, gotta get a ring light.
Here.
I'm like,
this
gotta
is my
get a
setup.
ring light.
It's like a chair, a cushion, and then a laptop, and then like the phone goes here. Super high tech.
Avi.
So Rhiana, it's Juneteenth. Does this holiday mean something to you? How do you feel about the fact that we're now celebrating Juneteenth?
I don't know. I appreciate it. I got the day off for Juneteenth, which was dope. Shout out to Roosevelt Institute. And it was interesting. I've never celebrated Juneteenth before, but I come from a family that is like, I always joke that my family is like super black. Like, we only have black Santa Clauses in the house. Like, we only have black Santas. At Christmas time, my mother did not allow children's books with white people in them. Like, there was just, like, you walking into my home was like, it's like, this is Wakanda here. We live in Wakanda. And so that being said, I grew up in Chicago, and Juneteenth wasn't like a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Our sort of closest thing to Juneteenth was something called like the Bud Billiken Day Parade, which happens in August and is like a big black community like parade celebrations, and it's just about black people. And so Juneteenth actually felt awesome. I always have a weird time on July 4th. It's an interesting thing to like celebrate the country being free when black people aren't free. But Juneteenth was nice. It felt like Independence Day, but with all the pride. And it just was like, I reflected on legacy and ancestors, and it was really good. I laugh though, because it's just so funny. I guess it's better late than never, but it's interesting, America being like, oh, black people, y'all are still here. Like, discover, like, it's been 155 years for Juneteenth, so it's interesting for the country to be like, oh, now.
Yeah, we're ready.
Yeah, we're ready. So that's,
And so you, on a normal day when you're not celebrating Juneteenth, you work on climate policy. You're right now at the Roosevelt Institute as a director there. And tell us what you're working on. What's next for climate policy in America? Give us the inside scoop.
Well, the thing that's really, I think, a lot of climate policy, at least where I work. So I work the Roosevelt Institute is an economic policy think tank in lots of ways. So we work on a lot of things, but the central sort of set of issues that align us are about the economy and structures of the economy. And so I work in sort of the intersection between economic policy and climate policy, because a lot of climate policy is economic policy, particularly when you're talking about sort of a Green New Deal style of mass decarbonization. And so a lot of climate policy right now, I think, is actually looking at the economic recovery from COVID-19 and trying to think through what elements of climate policy function as economic stimulus, which can help us sort of regrow the economy, spark new industries, and how can we use decarbonization as essentially the engine of economic recovery.
Yeah, there's the idea of a green stimulus.
Yeah.
If we're going to be dumping trillions of dollars into the economy, can we use that to build the future that we need? Can we use that to decarbonize? Can we use that to support renewable energy and green jobs and restoring ecosystems and supporting regenerative farming and like the good stuff, instead of sort of bolstering existing industries that are really damaging to the environment, like how they changed the rules for
for the fossil fuel companies to be able to access the Federal Reserve bailout program. Yeah. So that's the interesting part of my work, is that, so that's obviously very bad for climate, but it's actually also very bad for the economy.
Yeah.
Because the things that they did to allow fossil fuel companies to essentially qualify for those bailout funds, because let's be clear, the fossil fuel industry wanted targeted support in the economic stimulus plan that passed, the CARES Act, and they didn't get it. There was a lot of pushback. They didn't get it. We didn't get emission standards, right, for sort of like carbon intensive industries like aviation, but we also didn't get targeted support for fossil fuels. But what's happened is that both fossil fuel companies have applied for and qualify for tax credits in the CARES Act. But in order to allow them to get money from the Federal Reserve actually had to make the program weaker, right? So it had to rules had to be changed to allow companies with more debt to join, to allow bigger companies to come in, and also the money is now allowed to pay down pre-existing debt, because the thing about a lot of fossil fuel companies is they were already in financial trouble far before COVID. And they, coal bankruptcies were already happening and that sort of thing. And so what you actually made the Federal Reserve do is take on riskier debt. A lot of fossil fuel debt is riskier debt. So you're actually using taxpayer money to put risky debt on the Fed books, right? And to make the program a lot weaker. And then when you do that too, you're also telling investors who are, might be squeamish in a recession, who generally are squeamish most of the time, but especially in a recession, you're telling them like, hey, it's totally fine to keep putting money in fossil fuels, right? Like the government is giving them money, so it messes up price signals. Renewables are doing really well, but they're not getting any support from the CARES Act. So you have this moment where actually renewables were surging ahead, but economic stimulus, it sets the shape of the economy for longer than the stimulus lasts. So investors are trying to see, now it's maybe a bit more uncertain, or it could be seen as more uncertain, and it gives investors a signal like, yeah, let's put money over there even though we know that all of this infrastructure will eventually will happen pretty quickly, likely have to decommission it, right? So you're actually getting the government not only involved in taking on riskier debt, but you're actually changing, sort of distorting energy markets and not even just energy markets, you're just sort of distorting capital markets and redirecting money in places where you actually probably don't want it to go. Mm-hmm. Not probably, you definitely don't want it to go. Like you don't. It's also, we're sort of one of the things that's allowed the U.S. to become sort of as prosperous over the last decade without, money actually going to most people, is we became like a big exporter of fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And it's probably longer than a decade. Fossil fuels aren't my area of climate policy. But basically, we export quite a bit of fossil fuel, and structuring the economic stimulus like this just sort of more deeply links our economy to an industry that is going to collapse. Like, it is going to have to go away. Mm-hmm. At some point. We talk about it as if it's a choice, but it is inevitable. Yeah.
The context of this, like, intersection of crises, right? We have a health crisis and an economic crisis precipitated, and we have the climate crisis, and then there's racial inequality crisis. Sort of in this context, as you're thinking about a Green Deal or climate policy, sort of writ large, a lot of things are changing in the public conversation right now. Like, a lot of things that weren't possible 6 months ago, we're now starting to see more support for in Congress and at state and local levels too. What kinds of doors are opening for climate policy?
Yeah. First, I just had to. Lyra wants to say hello. She's hanging out here. But
time I see a picture of dog, I just want to come over and pet it, just for
I showed you because a minute ago she was peering over my knee, like, "Hello, world."
Give me a few.
So your question is, what are the new openings?
Yeah.
So I will say, in lots of ways, this is the moment that the Green New Deal was kind of built for, right? I just think it's really interesting because when the resolution came out last year, it had to be 6 months just talking about why equity should even be related to climate policy, why any of these issues were related. And it actually sucked up a lot of time, where we actually didn't even get to talk about a lot of the content of the Green New Deal, because for a lot of people, the ideas that these two things should be linked was just this was all we could talk about. And I mean, people went ham. Some pretty well-respected climate experts, asked me things like, why would you put equity next to this? Isn't this too much? You'll never get climate policy. I had white men tell me that if we didn't do anything about climate change, it would be my fault because we decided to bring oppression into it. I had a white man literally write me an essay about and send it to me about how about how oppression had been around sort of a long time, group-based oppression. So why deal with it now? It was just something that we were that we would just go through. This was, and this is it was wild. And so in a lot of ways, these developments are very good for a Green New Deal because people are talking about and seeing how systems are related, right? How if you and the fact that the policies that we enact reverberate across different sections of our lives. And so thinking about COVID, right? The link to air pollution, which has everything to do with the fossil fuel industry, and now it's becoming clear that like climate change, as it gets hotter, places with more pollution, it's causing lower term birth weights for Black women, right? It's translating to like higher maternal mortality rates. And I think before this moment, people were still struggling to make those connections, right? How does air pollution over here, affect anything about how you get sick, and what does that have to do with our economic system? And then, of course, you see COVID, right? You're having higher rates of Black mortality, but these are still the same Black and Latino mortality rates, but these are the same people who are essential workers, right? So you see it all being connected. And so that's really good, because I feel like, I actually told someone the other day, they were like, what do you think? I was like, I think it proves that I was right. That's what I think.
It's all connected, right?
It's like, and I think that because we had that narrative sort of out there with the Green New Deal, and we're building these like new coalitions, that it's actually helped climate change not fall out of the conversation in the way that it could, right? Like when you see Sunrise throwing down with Movement for Black Lives, right, and organizing hubs to go out and protest against police brutality and against structural racism, right? Like you see these sort of connections. You see, immigrant rights groups throwing down about climate change because some climate folks went out and threw down around detention centers, right? So it's also realizing that our movements are intersectional and our issues are intersectional. And so I think that has been really good. And I think also the sort of depth of the recession that we are, starting to see. We still don't know how bad it will be, but it also point to pretty fucking bad. And I think that opens a door to talk about large-scale public investment, because you need that to sort of climb out of this hole, right? But public investment needs a place to go, and decarbonization is there. And so you have, Joe Biden talking about how the thing that will get us out of this recession will be decarbonization, right? And investments in clean energy. Like he has said that basically he intends to use that as an engine to like get out of the recession. And so these openings are happening, both to talk about also how climate change is connected to environmental justice, because I think we talk about them in the same conversations a lot, but often people are like, how is wastewater sort of, what does that have to do with climate change, right? What does warming climate have to do with particulate matter? And then, of course, like I said, you see these studies where you realize that like they're interacting. Particulate matter, things happen when it heats up, and it makes, it leads to these bad outcomes, including higher maternal mortality rates.
Because we have to move on to the next guest in a minute, I want to ask how can we support your work?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would just ask people to like learn more about the Green New Deal.
It's 14 pages.
The resolution's only 14 pages.
Really, it'll take you like 5 minutes to read it, and then we can all have an informed conversation about what this thing actually is, instead of believing
whatever's out there. Yeah, and there's like constant sort of work being done to make turn the Green New Deal into concrete policy proposals, and to really dig into what the reality of it will look like. So Sierra Club just released like jobs numbers to show how many millions of jobs would happen if you implemented a Green New Deal. So I would say check that out. And then I just encourage everyone to actually join an environmental justice group in your area. They exist everywhere, and you're going to meet the people who know the most about why your environment, the environment around your house looks the way that it does. And often those folks also have connections to the movements for racial justice, for democracy. They tend to be intersectional places. So I just always tell people, like, go there, learn, throw down with people alongside community, so that you know that you're being led by the things that they want and need. And also you're going to get connections to lots of these other movements in the meantime.
Yeah. I have one more question. What would you be doing with your time if racism didn't exist?
Oh, child. Oh, I think about that all the time. Honestly, I would probably be a baker or a food scientist. I love baking. And like that's the job I think I would really like to do, because you just get to be with people in their happy moments. But I feel compelled to do the work that I do, because I'll be damned. Like, I will be damned if I leave this world and it's not a little bit better for other Black girls. Like, it's not going down like that. So this is what I do and I have to do, but I'll just be chilling. I would be chilling, and I certainly would get Ben Shapiro the hell out of my Twitter feed.
Well, thanks for hanging with me for a little bit and for all the work you do. Follow her at rguns with 2 N's on Twitter, where that's where the fire happens, not on Instagram for her.
No.
And she's at the Roosevelt Institute. She has an op-ed Times recently that is extremely good, and I highly recommend. Just Google her name, New York Times. And we got some requests to see your dog one more time.
Oh yes, this is Lyra.
Oh my God, what a pooch.
Okay, that's my bud.
Got all these people watching. Okay, bye.
Bye.